This is a 67 Fender Super Reverb. All the iron has got 66 date codes on it. When it came in, these two sockets had been replaced poorly with the wrong sockets. The bear traps were missing. Someone had put in the spring type, and this socket, all the pins were pretty much shot. So it's got 3 new Belton sockets. Not Belton, phenolic sockets, sorry, with Belton tube retainers, the bear traps. New filter caps throughout. Let me sit down to do this part. On the filter caps, I'm going to show a video soon showing the entire process on these old Fenders, but originally the original caps had really long leads, and those leads went underneath the board and connected all the grounds and stuff. And they would be the jumper wires going to these balancing resistors here and here. And what a lot of guys do is they'll cut the old leads and just either tack solder new cap leads to the old leads, or they'll twist them, which is a little bit better, or they'll just cut the old leads down here at the eyelet, and they'll just poke the ends of the new leads into the eyelets, and you end up with very poor, unreliable connections and just mounds of solder because you're adding new solder to the old solder. The dropping resistors here and the balance resistors here are often unreliable after 50 plus years. So what I do is I take the entire board out and I clean it, and I get all the old dirt and solder and flux off the board, and I replace the jumper wires on the bottom for the grounds, and the leads going from these eyelets to the balance caps, and the new components go in, and underneath they're crimped over so there's a mechanical connection before solder is applied. And then, since the old doghouse had some foam in there to press down the caps, and that had all degraded, I've removed it on this one. And the new caps are physically different sizes than the old caps. Instead of having foam on top pressing these in place for mechanical support, I use a very small amount of silicone. It's non-reactive silicone, and when it comes time to change these caps in 15 years or whatever, it's fairly easy to remove. Just a razor blade will take it right off. It doesn't hurt anything. It's not glue. It's not hot glue. But the end result is a cap which is not, the body weight is supported by the silicone, and there are nice curves to the leads. These leads are not under any stress. There's no stress where the lead joins the capacitor body, and there's no stress at the solder joint. And the leads are crimped underneath with like a 1/4 inch excess wire down there. So there's a mechanical connection, and this thing would work and actually be pretty solid even without solder. What the solder does, besides helping it hold in place even stronger, is it keeps oxygen off the various metals that are in contact with each other. If this were not soldered, you could have some oxygen get between the metal where this contacts that, and you'd have poor connection. So the solder just gets all the oxygen out, makes it one continuous piece of metal, but it's not being used for mechanical support or glue. And these are little 2-watt resistors I really like. They're smaller than the 1 watts that they originally had, but they're better resistors. So let me pause this and flip the amp over, and we'll get to the rest of the stuff. Okay, those replaced sockets. They had been replaced because this one had burned and charred the heater wiring. So the heater wiring here was charred all the way up to about here. And the previous tech who had changed out the sockets poorly had not changed out that wire. So this has got new heater wire all the way from where it comes out of the power transformer to the 2 octals, and then it goes to the existing wire here. And I use stuff that looks pretty much exactly like the original wire. You can see that's the original wire, that's the new wire. You have to look very closely, but so it's the same type. At first glance it looks original, much more solid. The new sockets have the grid stoppers mounted just like the old ones. Instead of having a 1 watt 470 ohm right up against the socket where all that heat is, because that's where the radiant heat rises from the tube. I've got these 3 watts mounted to the side, slightly away from the worst of the heat, and they're higher quality capacitors. These are wire wounds, not capacitors, resistors. Sorry, just woke up. So you've got 3 watt wire wounds mounted with some space to the side, so they're out of the direct heat. Rewired the rectifier socket. You can see I've got a new power cable. Instead of using the old style clamp, which really puts a lot of stress on the cable, this is a Heiko I love. It puts even pressure on all sides of the cable. And it's been redone to modern safety codes where the hot is fused, then switched, rather than fusing the hot and then switching to neutral. You can see the longer green wire for the ground. I want this ground wire to be longer than the hot and neutral. So if something were to really pull on this cord, if this were to fail, this is very unlikely to fail, but should it fail, the hot or neutral would break off first and the ground would be connected, would be the last one to be stressed. It's just a safety thing. It's also a code. Let's see, you can notice the nice shiny joint here on the bias, the shiny chassis solder joint here for the AC ground, and this one here, which is the HT center tap from the power transformer, and the ground for the reservoir cap. Originally this amp had them made to chassis with ground lugs that were held in place by the power transformer mounting hardware. But in pretty much all Fenders, starting from the Deluxe Reverb up, it's not as much a problem with the Princeton because it's a relatively lightweight power transformer, but especially in a Super Reverb or a Twin Reverb, the weight of the transformer over time makes the steel chassis flex. I don't know if the camera picked this up, but there's a little bit of a flex here in this chassis where it had just bent over time. And when that happens, these nuts come loose. And when these nuts come loose and they're also providing ground, you have bad grounds. And then once they come loose, there's a gap between the metals, and you can get all kinds of corrosion, both dirt and actual dissimilar metal reactions. So to get the best grounds in these amps, I remove the ground lugs and I wire directly to chassis, which is how the pre-CBS Fenders did it. I think they transitioned at some point in '66. I'm not sure exactly when that started, but by '67 they'd gone to the ground lugs, and that was a way to make it go faster in the factory, but it's not as good. This is the more reliable way to do it. On the bias board, you can see I've got some new resistors here from the heater supply. They're just balance resistors here. Every component on the bias board has been replaced. I used to only replace this cap, and sometimes I'd replace this resistor if it had drifted. But in the past 3 years, I've noticed a lot of the original diodes beginning to fail, which I had not run into before. So maybe we're just getting to the end of life for the original diodes. But now, especially for bias, I replace them on site. So all new components on the bias board. It's a very high quality capacitor here. Everything is cleaned, all the old solder and flux is removed, just like I do on the filter caps board. Sorry about the shaky camera work. I'm alternating between standing and sitting for this. So on the preamps, everything is stock at the socket, though except for the added shielded wire, which I'll address in a little bit, though I did improve the lead dress on things. It looks almost all original now on the board. Has a lot of replaced resistors, but they're replaced with the exact same type that it would have had originally. A lot of them had drifted or were noisy. This capacitor here, this 22 nanofarad, I changed out because the old one was bad, but this is the same class 2 ceramic disc that they would have used originally. Got new cathode bypass caps. These are some great Vissches that I really like. I had to change the 3 caps in the trim circuit because the old ceramic discs had drifted in value and the speed was way too fast overall. It's got a new roach in there because the old neon was throwing some serious spikes in there. I do have the cap in here across the roach, which is to prevent ticking, which is a factory service bulletin from Fender. That's very common. The main thing I had to do on this board was there was a lot of leaking DC throughout the board. And that happens because the board absorbs moisture over the years and contaminants over the years. And in this particular amp, it was made worse because at some point, either there was a liquid spill, coffee, tea, Coke, I don't know, or someone in the past had decided to clean the entire amp with WD-40 and it had left a dark brown sticky film. And it was between the top board and the insulator board, and between the insulator board and the chassis. And crucially, it was between this brass grounding strip and the chassis. So I had to take all the pots out and get this brass grounding strip out and clean it on both sides and clean the chassis where it contacts and redo all these grounds, put it all back together, and made sure all the pots were tight and the pot surfaces were cleaned, and the pots have been cleaned. And I had to get all that residue off both sides of the board and the chassis beneath the board. And I had to soak the board with isopropyl alcohol and heat it up to drive all the moisture out. So the DC leakage is gone. It was about 7 volts at this eyelet right here. And what happens is that this B plus eyelet here, it's got like 400 volts. And if you have a conductive path through the board to this eyelet, which should have no volts, well, you get voltage there. And that makes for a lot of noise and scratchy sounding pots and static and pops throughout. So a lot of the work doing that is invisible when it's done, but that took much longer than any of the other work I did on this amp. And if you're really familiar with Fenders, you'll notice that some of the wires that used to go beneath the board now connect on top of the board. It's not a drastic change. That is because some of the old wires had also had some of that brown stuff in them, and the cloth covered wires had just soaked it up like a sponge. So this yellow wire here and this yellow wire here I had to replace, and the reverb wires have been replaced as well, because once that brown gunk gets into that cloth covered insulation, it's no longer insulating. And this yellow wire, which is a B plus connection, had 30 volts on the cloth. So that wasn't good. So after doing all that, everything was pretty cool, except that both channels had a higher noise floor than they should have had, and there was a lot of noise, microphonics noise, especially if I touched the grid wires of V1 and V2. And that was because the old cloth covered wire on those had also absorbed that stuff, and the wire insulation had become rigid. So it was not just conductive, it was rigid. So I put in some nice shielded wire for the grids, both the inputs of each channel and the volume returns of each channel. And that's something you find in later Fenders anyway, and it's a good thing to do. So this is a very good sounding 67 Super Reverb that sounds like 67 again. You'll get to hear it in a moment. The other things I did, it had a bad reverb tank, which was sad. The old tanks don't always last. I went with an MOD tank. I'm sorry, not an MOD tank, a Mojotone tank. I've done reverb shootouts for myself, where basically I bought one of every currently available reverb tank on the market. And it used to be that the MOD tanks won out. But starting about 1.5 years ago now, 2 years ago now, whatever it was, the MOD tanks started to get really exaggeratedly long in their decay and overall sound too dark. And they had been great before that. And so when I bought all the tanks and tested them, of the currently produced tanks, I find that the Mojotone medium decay tank sounds the most like the Gibbs and old Accutronics long decay tanks for Fenders. So that's what you're going to be hearing in the video for this. Also, this amp had 4 Kendrick black frame speakers. Sadly, the old CTS Alnicos were long gone. And the Kendrick black frames have a good reputation, but they had voice coil issues. They weren't sounding very good. And my speaker guru buddy says that that's because they had 1-inch voice coils, and the old CTS speakers for these had 1.5-inch voice coils, and that the 1-inch voice coils don't last in Super Reverbs. And as he knows more about speakers than I do, I took his word for it. So what you're going to be hearing this amp with is a new quad of WGS G10Cs, which are their version of the old Jensen C10N with 1.5-inch voice coils. And it sounds really good. That said, if you can find the old CTS Alnicos for Super Reverbs, have them reconed by someone who really knows what they're doing. That is the best possible sound, and nothing comes close. The Webers are quite good if you get the right ones, and these WGS G10Cs sound fantastic. But there's something about the sound of those old CTSs when they're working right. It's just untouchable.